This is Phil Lamar, and you are listening to the Geekcast Radio Network.
Here it is, a groove slightly transformed. Just a bit of a break from the norm. Just a little something to break the monotony of all that hardcore dance.
Hello, and welcome to the Comic Concierge Podcast, a podcast that believes that comics are for everyone. The key is finding the right one. This is one of my weekly wrap-up episodes where I go through the week that was in comics and give you my thoughts and opinions on some of the most notable titles that were released. A slight spoiler warning, as I do get into some spoilers. I will try to avoid the biggest surprises, but if you want to know absolutely nothing about a book before you read it, check the show notes and I'll put timestamps for every book I'll be talking about today. I do start each week with my recommendation of the week, and my recommendation of the week is not necessarily what I would think is the best book, but what I feel like is the most appropriate starting point for that week, in the sense of if you're going to the comic book store and you've never read a comic before, or you're looking for a new series, or just a good jumping on point that doesn't feel redundant. It's a book that fits that mantra. Obviously a good book, but not necessarily the best book always of that week. Although this week, it is a case where I feel like it is in the running for the best book of the week, because it's Doctor Strange number 390. It is written by Donny Cates, and the artist for this is Fraser Irving, and this is actually Donny Cates' last issue on Doctor Strange, so it may at first seem like a weird jumping on point, as Mark Waid is going to be taking over this title, I believe, next month with his new storyline. However, despite that, it actually goes back to the beginning. Really seems like the storyline is taking place before the first issue, or in between the first issue of Doctor Strange, and this is before he confronts Loki. When Donny Cates took over the book, Loki became Sorcerer Supreme, and Doctor Strange became a veterinarian, and it's just this odd tale of Doctor Strange and an encounter with Zelma, who was his apprentice, but mostly the encounter with Spider-Man as well. And it's just an offshoot story. It's kind of wacky and a little bit weird, but in a good way. It has that sensibility that you really get with Donny Cates, but it's a little bit more laid back. If you look at some of the stories Donny Cates has done for Marvel, Venom, Thanos, even Doctor Strange, they've been these big bombastic storylines, hell coming to Earth, timeline changes, Thanos destroying everyone, utter chaos everywhere, really. This is a little bit more laid back for Donny Cates. It's a little more personal focused, and in the fact that this is really low key. And it was, in a way, that was what was endearing about it. It starts with just some great interaction between Spider-Man and Zelma. And I love the way that Donny Cates writes Spider-Man. I'm excited to see if he ever appears in his Venom series. Although, sensibilities-wise, tonal-wise, it's a lot more sardonic than his really dark and depressing Venom. However, I think he really has a good voice for him. And I should also mention, I mentioned the artist. Chip Zdarsky actually has a guest page, I would say, in this, where Spider-Man, I don't want to ruin it for those who have not read it, has an encounter with a friend, I would say. I don't know, it was a little wacky aside that it was rather funny, and I thought it was quite clever. And ultimately, that's what really made it work. And it also ends on a little bit more of a somber note, but in a good way. I was never a huge fan of this relationship between Zelma and Doctor Strange, like, especially the more they try to make it a little bit more romantic. It just never felt that way to me, but I thought the way it ended was on point and actually a good conclusion to that storyline. I don't know if Mark Waid has any interest of continuing it when he takes over this title. If he doesn't, I would completely understand that, as I believe his book is going to see Doctor Strange in space, which I guess is a theme now, as we'll talk about with other books that came out this week. But I just thought it was really well done, well structured. The artist, Fraser Irving, it's a different look for this book. It's a much different than some of the artists that had worked with Donny Cates prior to this. I did like it. It was a little bit weird to get used to, especially the coloring, a little bit more of I want to say a faded look to it, but it worked well. The way he depicted Peter Parker, it took a little bit to get used to. There's a specific panel, and I thought, like, he gives this face. It's hard to describe, but it's like, I do feel like that face looks like it doesn't, like, it's not a face that could exist in human life. However, just the expression on it, to me, is like, that's what I want from my Spider-Man. Spider-Man or Peter Parker that can have that type of expression, that kind of joy when he finds out what he's able to do. So it was good. It was a well-told, almost like a painterly quality to it, especially with the coloring. if this is the last story that he does for Doctor Strange, I think it's fitting. Again, I think it's just interesting that polar opposite of what I've been used to with Doctor Strange. I think this is probably Donny Cates' best issue with Doctor Strange so far. I've liked what he's done with Doctor Strange. It's been fun. It's been enjoyable. The Damnation storyline, which I talked about a little bit, I thought it was cool. It was fun seeing these Midnight Sun people come that we don't get a lot of. It had some good moments. He worked with Nick Spencer on that, and you can kind of tell where he wrote some and Nick Spencer wrote some. But maybe I'm wrong, because I never took Donny Cates for someone that would have that sarcastic sensibility to him all that much. But reading his Spider-Man, I could be very much wrong. But this is a great issue. Even if you've not read anything that Donny Cates has done previously, he read any of his Doctor Strange stuff or any Doctor Strange stuff, really. Yeah, like I mentioned, it's tying back into some things in relationships that happen. But, if you know Spider-Man, you know Doctor Strange, they have a great interaction. And I really love, there's a great speech that Spider-Man gives to Doctor Strange. I think it's really a motivating factor to him, kind of explaining that even if Doctor Strange is not being the hero that he thinks he is, ultimately he's much more heroic than he gives himself credit for. And I thought it was a good way to kind of counterbalance that self-seriousness that you can get with superheroes sometimes, while showing like the person with the weight on their shoulders that can't do it anymore. They feel like a failure, and you just get someone like Spider-Man to say the right words to you and then get you back on track. So, a solid issue, one of my favorite issues of this week, as I mentioned. So I would highly recommend picking it up. And I'm excited to see where Cates goes next, knowing that going with Venom, and he has the Ghost Rider story coming up in a huge Inhumans thing. He's one of the biggest names in comics. But I don't know how Mark Waid's going to do with Doctor Strange. We'll see. I just know that he's going to have to do something special to really live up to what Jason Aaron and Cates did with the title. Another big title that came out this week, perhaps the biggest for Marvel, was Black Panther #1. And this was the Black Panther fresh start that started with still the writer of Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's been on Black Panther for a good 2 years now, and artist Daniel Acuna. This is designed to be a new starting point, a fresh start for those that have not been keeping up with the title, or at least that what it's been billed as. And I did notice a number of reviews of this that indicated that they felt that wasn't the case with this, as they were kind of lost and weren't sure what things was going on. And reading it, I actually think that's a little bit kind of the point. So this takes place in possibly the future. It's not completely known at this moment in time, but it's where people from Wakanda have traveled into space and developed their own little space community. The main character that we're following, which we assume is T'Challa, we don't know for sure, awakes, and he finds himself to be the slave of this alien race, and he's trying to escape over and over again. It reminded me of something like Planet of the Apes, for example, where you have someone be placed into a world. It seems at first like he can't even speak, and he's just trying to find his way out because his people have been, for some reason, enslaved, and they're using these vibranium mines and things like that. So at the same time, he's also being haunted by this woman with white hair, which we could assume might be Storm, because, T'Challa did previously marry Storm. If that's a relation, we don't know exactly. And at the same time, there's another faction of people that may be trying to help T'Challa escape, or this person escape from this slavery encampment from this race. And it's kind of this cool futuristic story where we see a lot of the Black Panther tech, like if they existed in Star Wars. And as indicated, I know a lot of people saying it's hard to understand what exactly is going on, and I think that's the point in a lot of way, because you're put in the mindset of the main character that is awoken into this world and not really sure who he is, what he's doing there, who's what, and what's exactly happening. And I think a lot of this are red herrings that are being set up. I have a good feeling that this person that we think might be T'Challa may not be. He may end up being a relative or something of that nature, or there's something to me that is going on here that is not clear, is being left vague on purpose. If this is happening in the future, perhaps, is it happening during present day Marvel Universe? That is not completely clear exactly, but I just ultimately think it was a good, fun issue, just seeing this world in the use of the Wakandan Empire in like a space-like setting. I thought that was a cool idea that's actually working, and I did appreciate the art. At times, similar to the art in Doctor Strange, it took a little bit to get used to. Some of the facial designs, especially the alien creatures, left a little bit to be desired. A lot of the, like, goons, for example, the guards that are guarding the base seemed a little bit less descriptive than I would like. They seemed kind of forgettable for the most part, but I thought it was an effective first issue of just establishing its concept, giving you an idea of what it's going to be doing, and I did try to adjust my process and where I'm talking about where are my possible recommendations of the week, and this does fall in the line. I did think long and hard that maybe this should be it being a number one and it being designed to be a jump on point, but as indicated, I think some people might be somewhat confused, thinking that it's not clear or everything is not laid out for you, and if that's something that bothers you as a reader, I could see it not working as well, but I feel like things will become clearer and clearer as it moves on. I have not been the hugest fan of Ta-Nehisi Coates' run on Black Panther. I found it was a little bit too tied to the history of Black Panther was impenetrable at points where it was just hard to understand exactly everything that was going on, and he's, a person that was learning comics, figuring it out, coming from another world, and I have not, been keeping up with it, and to me, this was a better first issue than his first issue with Black Panther, and I know he'll also be taking over Captain America next month, and has me a little bit more hopeful that he'll be able to make that a successful title. And speaking of Mark Waid again, I guess he'll be popping up here and there. He's leaving that book with Ta-Nehisi Coates coming in, and I've loved what Mark Waid's been doing with that title. And I am hopeful that Ta-Nehisi Coates can bring something to it, because Captain America is my personal favorite character, so we'll see how that goes. But this, to me, was a huge improvement over the previous Black Panther stuff I read from him, and I'm excited to see where this goes next. Another book that was in the running for recommendation of the week was Skyward #2, and I thought this was a good issue in continuing to build the world of Skyward. The first issue I thought was really effective in establishing the concept and giving you a sense of who the main character was. And the idea behind this book is that on one day, on G-Day, gravity stops working the way it should, causing utter chaos. People literally begin floating away into space, and now it's flash forward and the world has adjusted and found ways to keep living on. And what issue #2 also brings into the fold is the fact that there are some people that are living on the ground still. They're utilizing technology and these magnets so they can kind of live life as if nothing has happened, or live life like it used to be. And I thought it brought up this really good point of seeing, a culture, a world that is still trying to cling to a past, and the present day people who don't even know that world. Like, they have no attachment to it. It's just an interesting idea where, you see a major event occurs that forever changes the world, and a lot of people still aren't able to overcome it, or aren't able to accept the way that society has changed, where a lot of people have been born into it and know nothing else, or find the idea of, being stuck to the ground just idiotic, and kind of not being able to just accept what the world is now. And I think that's an interesting idea, and I hate to bring everything back to September 11th, but I think that is kind of point when you think about it now though, that that happened 17 years ago, and now you're living with a generation that grew up post that and don't know what life was like beforehand, and everything that did change and adjust, and how a lot of us, myself included, still think of what life was like before it, and kind of wish for a lot of that to return, where others are just already past that point and just like, come on, we move on. There's other things that we need to accept. It's not an exact comparison. I don't think this is going for that purpose, but it's certainly something I feel like that does come up in the discussion, and something that you can make an allegorical link towards for sure. And again, I just like that idea of seeing how people adapt and adjust to this new world setting, and how some won't. And we get a little bit more information regarding how the main character's dad may have been linked to G-Day, and we get who possibly will be probably the main villain of all this, and what it all means. But it wasn't to me maybe as fun as the first issue. It didn't have art-wise, there wasn't as much to do, because this was taking place mostly on the ground. But I thought, in the sense of building this world and the concept more, it was effective in that manner. And even if you have not read the first issue, I think, since it's only on issue 2, there is, I think, enough here to, enjoy it, if you do like it, going back and picking up issue number 1. But I really like the series. It's a good, cool idea. I think scientifically it probably makes absolutely no sense, and there's probably a lot of holes that can be poked into it. But in the sense of making a cool story, it works for me. All right, well, let's move on to another book that came out this week with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Urban Legends number 1. And this is kind of an interesting story before even getting to the comic, the idea of this coming out. So this was actually a series that originally came out in the 90s through Image, but I guess actually never officially had an ending. It's written and by Gary Carlson and art by Frank Fosco. And I guess IDW took this and now they're reprinting it all over again. I think with possibly new colors. It's hard to tell. I've never read the original series. It does seem like the coloring is a little bit updated, or at least maybe tuned up a little bit. They're also going to, I think, find a way to have the creators finish it this time around. And with that, it's kind of reading it. It does feel dated, and how could it not? Because this is legitimately a comic that came out in the 90s. You know, some of the character designs do feel like, oh, the costuming specifically, it's like, oh man, that is very much what you would see a lot in the 90s. A lot of like scantily clad women with costumes that make no sense. Things trying to be edgy, and kind of what I didn't like a lot about 90s comics, this idea of kind of injecting violence just to be violent, trying to be like, oh, we're being cool because we're taking this property that is known to be more of a kid-like property, even though the original comic is not that, and bringing it back to its roots. But are you going too far with it? Are you making it a little bit too ridiculous? And I will say, at least I do find it to be, it's out there. I mean, they're certainly going for it full board. It makes more sense in the sense of this feels like actual ninjas. I did feel like when it came to the violence level, it was a little bit weird. It was a little more graphic. I mean, the turtles, I'll just say that, man, they do not go through unscathed at all. And I'm curious to see where this goes exactly. There's some pretty bloody affairs that happen in it, and I was like, wow, this is not your grandfather's turtles, but I guess it is because it came out in the 90s. So I don't know, I thought it was okay. I did think the structure of it was a little bit weird, and it felt like it starts in the middle, you jump right in where this huge action set piece is occurring, and these villains who I don't know who they are break down, come into the turtles' lair, and start kind of wreaking havoc, and then it takes a step back, but still, this exactly what's the purpose behind all this, what's ultimately, as an intro issue, just figuring out exactly where is this going, and what is the reason behind all this occurring. It was left a little bit vague. It felt like the biggest purpose of this was like, let's set the tone right away to let you know that, yeah, we're gonna go there with this. We're gonna be we're gonna be edgy, and I don't know. It was okay. I'm going to continue reading it because I think it is kind of a novelty in the sense of seeing this thing come back, and I'm interested in seeing how exactly do you finish a story 20 some odd years later in a way that makes sense, and especially when it comes to the art design, can you make it feel that way? You know, can you try to replicate that all over again? And it's something similar happened, and I can't get a chance to read it this week as well with Marvel, as Jonathan Hickman looked to finish his S.H.I.E.L.D. story that happened. You know, there was missing a few issues that, you know, it was a story that people thought would never actually get finished because he left Marvel. He's come back to finish that now, and I need to go back and reread S.H.I.E.L.D. as I spend some time and to see like how that works. But it does seem like, along with TV shows getting second lives, that's also now the same thing with comic books, that comics are getting the second life in different spots because of there being so many outlets and there being so many publishers that are hungry for content. Now some of those stories that never got finished might actually have the opportunity to be finished now. So I thought that's kind of a intriguing trend that I've been seeing more and more with comics. All right, well, let's move over to the world of DC for Flash number 47. Flash 47 was the beginning of the Flash Wars storyline. The storyline's been building for some time in the pages of the Flash comics. And, you know, I went into this with, I think, high anticipation. I thought the buildup has been pretty solid. And I thought, okay, well, let's see how this goes. And as a first issue to this major story arc, it ultimately was rather underwhelming. It's, I think, suffered from the fact that it's, to me, at this point in time, not offering a whole lot new in the world of Flash, and even within itself. And I think it's also already somewhat convoluted, which is sometimes the case with Flash because you're dealing with multiple Flashes, timelines, and things like that. But it starts with these renegades, the task force coming to the present day to take Iris for killing Eobon Thawne, and the Flashes don't want to do that. And, have this fisticuffs of that trying to protect her. And it was fine, there was nothing bad. But, if this is the huge event that's supposed to be occurring, and this is like, okay, this is bringing Flash to another level, this to me didn't really do that. It's just like, okay, there's nothing to me that signifies that this is going to be bringing anything new to the table or taking the character in a direction that has not been there. And even where it ends up, the big reveal of there's a major character that steps out, and it just feels like, okay, this is, oddly enough, for a character like Flash, feels like we're spinning in circles here for a moment in time, and it seems to be tying into Wally and his memories and everything that's been happening since the beginning of Rebirth. And I think part of the problem is the fact that they've been building this up for such a long time, bringing Wally in and how he's been kind of the key to this entire Rebirth thing, and it just feels like it's a mystery that keeps on just prolonging with no real key answers, and also no really reason to care all that much, to be honest with you. There's so much going on in DC right now that it seems like an afterthought. And it's like, okay, is this even something that's really, do we care now why Rebirth happened? It seems like we're already 2 years into it. Is this tying into that? I don't know. And I'm hopeful that maybe it can pick up steam. Like, if this was like the Prelude issue, I think I would enjoy it a little bit more. It just, for a Prelude, for an event that had many Preludes already that I thought were more fun and enjoyable, it was a little bit odd. And also the art was just, to me, okay. It didn't have that kinetic energy I want with a Flash comic. So I don't know. I'm not in love with it. I'm a little bit disappointed too. And I guess a part of that was just having so much high expectations coming into it. All right, let's continue with DC as we look at Justice League No Justice, number 3 of 4. And I like the first 2 issues of Justice League No Justice. I went to it with a lot of apprehension because I didn't really like Metal all that much. And now at issue 3, it's beginning to lose me a little bit. It's suffering from a lot of the problems I felt with Metal, where things are getting overly convoluted, a little too much going on, to the fact that there's so much going on that nothing is going on, and we're dealing with a lot of people just talking about things that they need to do, and I don't know if it's just because of the changing artists from this issue to next issue, but it felt like this one was specifically bogged down with just a lot of overly rock conversations about everything they needed to do to win. It just seems like when you play a board game for the first time and someone's explaining to you all the rules and everything they need to do in order to win, and how ultimately you're like, okay, let's just play it because I'll learn a lot more when I do it that way. I just wanted to say that. Just let things happen. Don't feel like you need to explain every minute detail about how everything works. Because when you do that, I think what I liked about the first 2 issues is that there were some room for good character moments. And now with this, if things are building up and coming to their boiling point, we're losing that. I will say there were some good moments. I am really liking what they're doing with Starro. I feel like he's probably had, or he, or whatever you want to call Starro, as a character, has had the most growth and some of the biggest standout moments of this series so far. So that has me excited to see like how he functions within the Justice League moving forward. But outside of that, like it seems like mostly everyone else is just in the background, and it also feels like a lot of what the story has been building upon, similar with Dark Knight Metal, is a lot of continuity connection being the biggest pieces of why this is important, in the sense of like at the end of last issue, a huge character reveal, and now it's like, oh, you remember this guy? I'm like, not really. And that's why is he important? Because he's important because he used to exist in this other storyline, but why is he important to this storyline? And it's never really all that much explained. And again, it reminded me of Metal, where you would have someone like Dream show up, and it's like, oh, what is that going to do? How's that going to change things? And it didn't really go anywhere all that interesting. So it has me concerned. It just seems like there's a lot of cooks in this kitchen, and that can be a problem. And it wasn't at first, but the more and more we're going with this, hopefully issue 4 can pull it around. And I'm going to be, I think, a lot more excited when all these teams kind of separate and these writers are writing their own stories and they're not trying to all fit this into one to one series. I mean, I still had fun with it. There's some really fun standout moments, like the idea of, it's basically Justice League trying to save the world, and that's cool, but I just, as this big thing that's supposed to be like the launching point to the new Justice League, it just seems like it is lacking in what makes me enjoy the Justice League, and that's character. And characters that, get to interact and have fun. And if the whole idea is like all these people that usually don't interact are now interacting, or are now forced to be a team, and you don't leave enough room for that to happen, or at least have conversations that are not geared towards plot only, it's not as intriguing to me as a reader. It's funny because I feel like Hal Jordan, the Green Lantern Corps, number 45, is approaching a similar idea that Justice League No Justice is doing, but it's doing it a lot better and a lot more effectively. And with this Dark Star storyline, you see these Green Lanterns going to all these locations to try to find help where they normally wouldn't. And it, to me, makes a lot more sense because it is doing exactly what I was asking for. And if it's Green Lantern going to Hammond, or if it's John Stewart going to Zod, every time they're seeking help from these people that are villainous, there is a personal connection to it, or at least there is a great conversation that happens where you see that this is not ideal for them. They don't want to be doing this. However, they have no choice, and this is the reason why. Like, for example, John Stewart, when speaking with Zod, he talks about how he used to be a Marine sniper and how he would make choices then that he thought were right at the time, and he doesn't feel bad for them, because a big piece of what this is about is how the Green Lanterns don't kill their prisoners. It's, it's that classic capital punishment argument that you get a lot with comic book superheroes, where superheroes usually don't kill, and sometimes they do, and we get that conflict a lot with someone like Punisher and Daredevil, and here it's more on a galactic scale, and it's even a little bit more intriguing because there are characters in which you can possibly not provide the same level of punishment, right? When you have a cosmic level character that is nearly immortal or can easily escape almost any prison, are you just creating a cycle? And I think there is some room here that the Dark Stars have in their creation, and their leaders have some reasoning and some legitimacy into their claims. And that's always good when you have some of that nuance and wiggle room between the conflicts of these two characters, and how the Dark Stars aren't necessarily pure evil. It's just the way that they go about things, and their extreme motives and methods are dangerous to all, and it could lead to some devastating conflicts. And you realize where someone like Zod has limits and the Dark Stars don't, and even if their motives fall more in line with that of the Green Lanterns, their methods are even more dangerous. So there's a lot of things, to me, a lot more to chew on with this storyline, and I know that this line is going to be ending at issue 50, which I feel sad, because I feel like Hal Jordan and the Green Lantern Corps has been one of the best DC titles, especially over the last year or so. And like I mentioned, the R2 has been really fantastic. It's amazing to look at. The coloring is exactly what you want for a Green Lantern title. So highly advise picking this up. Start with the first issue, the red, of the Dark Star storyline, and I think you'll be able to follow enough of it and enjoy it. As I just recently jumped back on, I got off of it for a little bit, and I wish I didn't, because it's realizing just how consistent this book has been. All right, well, let's move over to the world of Marvel as the Infinity Countdown keeps going, as we have a lot of these different spin-offs that have been going on with the Infinity Countdown, and this week saw the release of Darkhawk #1, and this is a continuation of the one-shot that came out a few months ago. When Legacy first started, they had a bunch of one-shots. They had one for Power Pack and one for Darkhawk, and I didn't read that, so it was a little bit lost at first. I've been following the Infinity Countdown, so I understood it well enough, but there's a prelude until we get to the main story that talks about the Weavers, or whatever they refer to as the actual Darkhawks that are trying to get into our universe. So I wasn't really up to that. I know Richard Rider's brother is a part of it, but ultimately it's about the Darkhawk from the 90s. He's now a beat cop, and he's trying to make his everyday living. And also coming back is another very 90s character in Deathhead, who comes to hunt him down because there's a bounty on his head. So this is a very much a 90s book in that way. Unlike the other Infinity Countdown tie-ins, this has nothing to do with the gems or anything of that nature, just focusing on the character of Darkhawk. And I don't know, where this is ultimately leading, if they're just trying to do like a soft reboot or backdoor pilot to a future series and just tying it into Infinity Countdown, thinking that would get more interest. But I thought ultimately it was an okay story. It was just, I think, setting the stage for him trying to get into space because he's trying to figure out things with his armor that have been going funky as they kind of redevelop what the Darkhawk armor was from the 90s. And I thought the art was pretty solid when it came to the character standpoint, like the character designs and things of that nature looked great. I did find the backgrounds were really lacking in any detail. It almost felt like you had characters in front of a green screen because everything behind them was so empty and lacking any type of detail or anything that felt like it was a lived-in world. But when it came to the actual characters and facial acting, it was really well done. So I was thinking if they can just find a balance between those two, with the future of going off into space, it may be less of an issue. But I did notice it in this. It just felt like it was like very hollow in that there was lack of depth to everything because of how empty all the backgrounds were. So overall, the thing was solid. If you're a huge Darkhawk fan, if you're a big fan of the 90s comics, this has a lot into it. But I don't know. I don't think it's really going to tie in majorly or have a lot of developments when it comes to the general story. And I do worry that they are bleeding this story a little bit too dry because they have all these different spin-offs, they have all these one-shots, and there's more coming down the line, and eventually it's just going to get too much. And I don't know if it'd be possible to pay all these threads off within a consistent and cohesive manner. Maybe they can. They did do it with Annihilation back in the day. I think they're trying to follow a similar method. But with Annihilation, why it worked is because those miniseries all kind of connected and then eventually went into the bigger series. But this also has the Infinity Countdown prelude, I guess, that's going on as well. So there's a lot of different moving pieces here. So I could only imagine just like, first of all, the cost is getting ridiculous. And then just trying to keep all the pieces moving, it's getting a little bit harder and harder. But it's at least been engaging and fun enough. So I think there's a Captain Marvel coming out next week. I'm just hoping that eventually we get to the point that this is all leading to, or it's going to become tiresome more and more. Also coming out this week was the end of Bendis at Marvel. If anything, I'm probably bearing the lead, taking this long to get to this book, but it is Bendis' last Marvel book, at least for now, with Invincible Iron Man number 600. And Iron Man's a book I've been sticking with here and there. It, to me, is going up and down in quality. It was 2 books at one point and kind of combined into one. And there were times where I was really digging it, and there's other times I wasn't as interested in, like, for example, the adjusting of who Tony Stark's parents are. I still feel like that was a choice that makes no sense and really hurts the character of Tony Stark because his father relationship is such a big part of who he is. And it didn't really lead to anything I felt that was all that interesting or said much about the character, unfortunately. But with it coming to an end, I thought I would pick it back up, see how things were put together, all the different pieces he has going. And I gotta say, I was not the hugest fan of this issue. It felt like one where a lot of things were wrapped up way too quickly or left dangling just because. I know maybe he had a longer plan in mind, but when he decided to make the move to DC, he had to speed things up. And also, this is like the 5th ending of different Bendis' goodbye to Marvel, and it's almost like the Return of the King with Lord of the Rings, right? By the 8th ending, you're like, okay, I get it, let's move on already. And I liked the ending of Jessica Jones, Defenders, and even Spider-Man, and I felt like those gave me everything I wanted, and I felt especially his letter at the end of his last Miles Morales Spider-Man issue said so much that going to this, it felt like this just came out last because of maybe the fact that it had different artists, so it took longer. I don't know, this seemed like the wrong book for Bendis to end his career on in Marvel, because, I don't think of Bendis, I don't think of his work on Iron Man, even though he's been running the title for some time. I do think of Spider-Man. I'd even think of Defenders, because it was one of his most recent books, and of course, Jessica Jones. So now to end it on Iron Man, especially this story, I do know, it's Riri Williams, and that's a character that he created and he cares a lot for. But again, that was a character that I felt like never got the opportunity to really come into her own, as we're already going back to Tony Stark as Iron Man again. So I don't know. I thought overall that there were some okay bits in here, and I did like the Doom story and where that developed, but ultimately it just didn't have that satisfying conclusion, or I didn't feel like it was Bendis putting his stamp on the characters that he'd been writing for some time, like it was with Jessica Jones, like it was for the Defenders, like it was for Miles Morales Spider-Man, where I felt like that book, all those books, encapsulated everything he did with those characters. This felt like, okay, I got all these threads. Let's just edit as quickly as I can so I can pass it on to whoever is going to be writing this next, which will be Dan Slott, which I am excited for. And next week is Bendis' work on Superman coming out, even though he's had 2 Superman stories already, but his new weekly series begins. But yeah, I would say if you're like, okay, let me pick it up because it's Iron Man 600, it's Bendis' last Marvel book, not an ideal spot. It doesn't really make sense if you haven't been following it, and it's not that great of an issue, so I would say it's a pass for sure. All right, let's keep talking about Marvel. Let's move over to Moon Knight number 195. And I specifically wanted to talk about this comic, this issue, because, one, I'm impressed by the range Max Bemis has done with this series since he took over Moon Knight. Like, I liked the beginning where he was building this rogues gallery for the character of Moonlight, and then we had a cool one-shot story where it got into the history of Moon Knight, Mark Spector, when he was a kid, and there was this story of him coming in encounter with a former Nazi who was undercover as a rabbi in the United States, and how that all worked out. And now this story is, man, very wacky, and in a good way. It has a little bit more of a wry sense of humor. At first I thought, looking at the art that Rob Gilroy was writing or drawing for Marvel, I'm like, wow, when did this happen? I feel like I had no idea. He had a similar cartoony style to it. It was a little bit different. It didn't look exactly like his work, but it's not the type of style I ever expect to see in a Marvel book. But looking at it, I'm like, wow, this is actually kind of interesting that Marvel would go this direction. And I do feel like that's one thing I do appreciate about Marvel over DC for the most part, is that they do, especially for their titles like Moon Knight, their titles that aren't necessarily marquee titles, will go out and try different types of styles where I feel like a book has more of a voice. That's what I loved about the series Power Man and Iron Fist. It had its own unique style and take, and this isn't Moon Knight 195 has not been a consistent art style, which can drive some people crazy, but I like the fact that each arc so far has had its own artist, and I hope that continues with this arc. The story itself is kind of weird in the sense of you have these collective people that are trying to become one, and they become this huge mass of like gigantic blob, really. Instead of it being an alien, it's a mass of actual humans. So it's not as dark and twisted as some of the other Moon Knight stories, which tells you a lot about Moon Knight when it's like a mass of human beings becoming a giant blob, is more on the lighter side for this book. But, there's not as much death and destruction or, dealing with characters that have multiple personalities. There's more of a consistent level of levity that keeps things at least somewhat fun in a twisted way. So if you're looking for something new and different, I think you can pick up this book and understand it well enough. Although just know that Moon Knight has all these different personalities, and the way they showcase that is that there's actually this like mindscape where all the different personalities kind of hang out and communicate with one another. So if you're wondering what is going on, that's what's happening. It doesn't really explain that to you, but if you can kind of grab in, it's actually a kind of good starting point. But I would say if you're at all debating about reading Moon Knight's had some amazing series by Jeff Lemire, Warren Ellis, Greg Smallwood's art on the previous series was amazing. That was one thing I did love about that run, is that it did maintain a consistent artist. I like Max Bemis. I don't know much about him before reading this, and I've been enjoying what he's doing with this character, and I hope he keeps on this title for some time. All right, let's move over to Oni Press for The Ballad of Sang, number 3. And I talked about the first issue when that came out and mentioned that I liked it, though. I loved the action of it. I thought it was really kinetic in that sense, but I thought the story seemed a little bit too cut and dry. This idea of martial artist coming back and trying to right the wrong of his master and sensei being brutally murdered. And I think for the most part, it does follow a similar set of rules and storytelling style, but I think what's really cool about it are the characters in the world it's building within itself. It kind of reminds me of something of John Wick, right? With John Wick, the story is pretty simple. A dude is trying to seek revenge for what happened to him, and that's kind of what's happening here. But what I love about it is the underground world that exists, in the sense of you have all these different types of factions and characters that have these extreme personalities. Last issue had these kind of 80s rockers with ridiculous hair, and you have this female gang in this one, where we're also finding a little bit more about Sang has kind of partnered up with this older woman, and we're learning more and more about her, and she seemed like out of her element, but we're seeing that actually she has much more of a storied history with her as well. So I think that's what made this book really compelling to me, was that even though the story itself is just kind of, cut and dry for the most part, it's everything around it, surrounding it. And again, the art's been a lot of fun and enjoyable. So if you do like something like Kill Bill, for example, that takes that martial arts type of genre and, puts its own little spin on it. I think that's something you would really enjoy with this. It's fun, it's enjoyable, it's kick-ass, legitimately. It is really kick-ass. The art and the fighting is really great. And I do like the character of Sang, adding a little bit of difference, the fact that he's mute and he only can communicate through, written word. As he writes, I think adds a little bit more layers to him as a character. And art-wise, they do get a lot out of the fact that you do get to understand who he is through his facial expressions, even though it is more of a cartoony style. So I would definitely recommend this book. I think it's rising up the ranks of the books I'm really enjoying currently on the shelves. All right, let's move over to the world of Dark Horse for Black Hammer Age of Doom #2. And I did see some people asking, is Age of Doom a good jumping on point for Black Hammer? And it's not. It's just a continuation of the Black Hammer series that's been going on. And this is what Dark Horse is making their norm, where every new arc is making its own mini-series. So instead of saying Dark Horse or Black Hammer issue number, whatever this would be, probably around the 20s, they're just naming it based upon the actual story arc and then the issue in which we're in. So this is just the second issue of this third story arc. So no, it's not a great jumping on point. Start at Black Hammer #1 and continue going. With that said, it is, again, being really great. It has everything I love about that Black Hammer universe. This issue focused a little bit more on Black Hammer's daughter, who's a new Black Hammer. We saw last issue that she was sucked into this other dimension, weird bar situation where we didn't know where she was. It was indicated that she was possibly in hell. And this issue, she actually does travel to hell as she's trying to find her way back, find her way to her dad. And her journey is probably the bulk of this issue, and I did enjoy that. I do like how she's growing as a character and her where she's leading up. It seems like much of this story arc will be about her trying to find her way back. And if the ending is any indication, she still has much more of a journey to go on. It's not going to be an easy fix. And I did find the ending character that it is playing off of quite intriguing. This has been a comic that's been based upon a lot of the tropes of the Silver Age, and it seems like this story arc might be getting more into some of the newer comics, some of the kind of changes we saw in the 80s and 90s, so I'm curious how it will play that. Also, one of my favorite parts of this series has been the relationship of the characters of Gale and Barbie, and they have a great conversation here just on the steps of the library about the relationships, about kind of things that they went through. Gale really gives this huge secret away about who she was hooking up with before she left, and just their interaction is just something about that relationship really works because Gale has this type of feelings towards him, and he also has unacquainted love with the local priest and how they kind of work off one another. It's a really fascinating relationship that I'm glad that Jeff Lemire takes a lot of time. I mean, this has 4 pages or so of them talking, and consider this as being a superhero story. Some may not be as willing to take that time. Personally, I appreciate that Jeff Lemire is always about putting the humans first, even if there are gigantic devil monsters in this book as well. So, if you like Black Hammer, I think the Age of Doom is picking up exactly where it should be. It continues to be one of the best comics on the shelves. It certainly is a slower pace, and some people probably would appreciate much more in a trade format because it does take its time. And I would say, story-wise, not a huge much has happened in these last 2 issues. It's really not much has progressed. A lot of the answers have not really been given. I did find intriguing that, one big piece of this was the library seemed to be leaking to all these possible answers, and now that actually seems not to be the case. So there seems to be a lot going on that we're not privy to, and every time we think we're getting an answer, something else happens. And I know sometimes that can frustrate people, but again, what I love about this book has always been the characters, and as long as I get those moments, I enjoy it. Also from Dark Horse or Berger Books, which is affiliated with Dark Horse, is Incognego Renaissance #4 came out this week, and I'm loving this book more and more with each passing issue. It's based upon the story of this African-American reporter who was growing up in the Harlem in the 1920s, and he's been investigating this murder, and the thing about it, though, is that since he has a lighter complexion, he can hide as a white person through some makeup and acting. He can get into some spots where other people can't, and he's learning more and more that he might not be the only person. And what this, I think, issue did was it really made you question a big piece of what occurred in issue number 3. He begins this relationship with a person he thought was a suspect, but it seems like that was a misconception. This, though, asks the question if that is actually the case. Is he being fooled? Is there more to that? And also what I loved about this issue as well is that it also got into other subcultures that had to hide who they were within that time period because of what it would mean. And in this case, it was those that were homosexual and how they would have to hide that as well, and the club that he went into. And I love that scene because it did not go at all the way I would expect it to. Like, there was much more of an acceptance, and it was not as big of a deal as I think most issues would make it out. He still was focusing on finding his issues. He runs into people he knows, and there isn't this like huge conversation about what's occurring. It's just kind of matter of fact. He's able to put the pieces together, but it's really not all that important. And still, what really matters is solving this case, or finding the story because of what it means. So I like that. Like it could easily get into this huge dissection of all these cultural issues, and it does, but not in the most obvious way. So, and I love it just because it's very rare that we get a book and a story where the biggest plot point is murder. And it so happenstance anymore, really, with like horror stories and things that we get. Like, murder is not that big of a deal, which is a weird thing to say, but it is kind of the case. In this, it's one specific murder that they're trying to find the mystery to. It's very old school storytelling, in my opinion, that we don't get a lot. Like, I love classic noir stories of the 20s and 30s and 40s, like Humphrey Bogart, and it has that type of feeling to it, that type of atmosphere. Not as exact, like this character isn't as damaged, there's not a lot of voiceover, it's not as gloomy, but in the way that the story is going about it, how he's trying to pick all these pieces, and as each piece he finds there's more and more of conspiracies here. What he thinks is just one small murder or one thing involving his friend seems to be involving a lot of people and a lot of cover up. It's the deeper he's digging, the bigger the hole becomes. And so if you like that type of story, if you enjoy that type of storytelling, or you just want something different, it's a black and white comic, which I know some people may not love, but I think it works for this story, and especially considering this time period. Keeping it that look, I think, gives it that timeless quality, and considering the subject matter, I think it makes more sense, and it certainly is like saying something, keeping it black and white for sure. So, all right, well, let's finish up today by going to the world of Aftershock, starting with Brothers Dracul #2, another Cullen Bunn series with Aftershock, where he takes some sorts of legend or mythological story and puts his own little spin on it. He has it with Unholy Grail, he did it with Darkhawk, and now he's doing it with Brothers Dracul. As the name would suggest, this is a Dracula story, getting into the days before Dracula was the Impaler. This is him growing up as a kid, or probably teenager most likely, where he's actually living with a warring sultan who has imprisoned him and his brother. They are basically slaves due to a war that his father lost, and he's actually put in charge to help protect the sultan's son as well. Last issue left with them going into this cave and killing this vampire, and this is the result of that. And we see where Vlad is put in a situation where he is told to protect this person that he hates, and he still does it, and what becomes of it, and how basically his work is being credited towards someone else, even though pretty much everyone knows that's not the case. And I enjoyed this story. I actually really appreciate the art, especially the coloring, because there's actually some brightness to this colors. The color palette is not at all what I would expect. A lot of greens and blues, and for a story about Dracula, not necessarily something I would expect. So I like that take on it. It's very varying. Even the look of the vampires, they have this bluish tint to them, and I think I do like their design. And I was looking for like one thing that kind of put this book onto, like what's going to be the hook, what's going to bring this book to the next level, and I felt like the very ending of this did that. Where I think it's becoming evident that this is not just going to be him growing up as a kid. There is more to this story, and I'm curious to see where it goes. I do like the relationship between Vlad and his brother, how that's developing, and I do wonder if we're getting to the point where we do flash forward to the future at all, because that's where the book started. But overall, I do enjoy Dracula as a story. I think he's a great character, and I always like it when they put it in more of a historical context like this does, but it does have that supernatural element to it. So I've been really enjoying this. I think it's one of Cullen Bunn's best books with Aftershock right now. So with this only being 2 issues, I think it's a good jumping on point. You could probably honestly pick up the second issue and get everything you really need to know. The first issue was really just getting the brothers to the location with the Sultans, getting him to that cave. This, I think, gives you a good understanding of where the characters are, the relationships, and we're looking forward to this. I don't know if it's a mini or if it's expected to be an ongoing, but overall, another good addition to the world of Aftershock comics. Alright, well, I got one more book to talk about today, and that is Her Infernal Descent #2, written by Zach Thompson and Lonnie Nadler, and also drawn by Kyle Charles. Brought to us by the wonderful folks over at Aftershock Comics, and I wish I was much more versed in the world of classic literature, because I feel like there would be so many pieces of this I would be picking up more so than I already am. It's a story about this woman who's actually traveling to hell, literal hell, to try to save her family that recently passed away, her husband and her children, and along the way she's been running into all these different literary and historical figures. Sometimes, people like Freud, for example, or even Edgar Allan Poe. Her actual guide has been William Blake, and I think what's been fantastic about this is just how it's actually utilizing a lot of their actual work, quoting it at times. It almost feels like it's some type of like weird book report where they're taking pieces of their classic work and looping it into this actual storyline. But I just really find the approach really fascinating. It's one of those books I feel like that has a lot to dissect and look into, and it's very much an intellectual book in that manner. For example, this issue had a conversation between the main character and Freud, and their back and forth was a lot of fun. And I have a basic understanding of psychology. I think I took some courses in college, by no means an expert, but even I was able to kind of pick apart a little bit of the digs here and there at him, or at least the representation of his findings. And what I find really great is how he's been utilizing those figures, in the sense of they've been using her as this like reflection board of trying to figure out where is their place now in current world politics, in the world people remember them. Do they still read their works? I think it's been an interesting idea that I've been appreciating, on top of this just general story of this woman trying to save her family. And I really find it fascinating where this book ends up. There's even some Kafka plays a big role in this book. So if you are a literary type of person, if you love reading books outside of the world of comics, I think this has a lot to go into, and this might be a great comic to give to some of your friends who don't love comics but they love literature. This, I think, has a lot to go into, and like I said, I probably would appreciate it a lot more if I read actual books at the same level that I read comics. But even without that, I've been finding it really well written and well told. The art's pretty solid as well. I think it certainly, I think, depicts hell in an interesting way. The world is super crowded, and it has a great conversation about, when you just think about the amount of people that are currently on Earth, what that would be like. Well, then imagine all the people throughout history in one location, like just the sheer amount of people that is. It's insane. So time almost has no meaning in that type of situation. So again, this is only the second issue as well. A good jumping on point for the most part. I would say probably start with the first issue, because it kind of sets the ground and gives you an idea of where this story is going. I think this is only designed to be 5 issues or 6 issues. I don't think it's going to be a super ongoing. I don't think it could be. But if you love something like Dante's Inferno and want to see a take on that, I think this provides that for you. Alright, well, that'll bring us to the end of this week's episode, and if you like what you're hearing, if you want to interact with the show, there's a lot of different ways to do that. You can catch me on Twitter. I am @MovieRevolt. The show is also on Instagram and Facebook. Just search Comic Concierge Podcast. You can email movierevolt@geekcastradio.com. Also, the show is on Geekcast Radio and early.co.uk. So if you want to leave a comment, go ahead and do that. And if you feel like you have some time to kill and you want to give us a review on iTunes, we greatly appreciate that. But for now, that'll be the end of this week's show. Remember that comics are for everyone. The key is finding the right one. Until next time, thanks for listening.
Adjust the bass and let the Alpine blast. Pop in my CD and let me run around and put your car on cruise and lay back, cause it's summertime.